Davante Adams is heading home. Originally from California, the 32-year-old vet is going off to the Rams. This impacts the fantasy football situation, not just for those who have him in Dynasty or Redraft, but for the Jets, the Rams, and the different moving pieces that have arrived at or left those teams in the last handful of days in lieu of free agency, even though Davante did not have to obey those rules. I'm Corey, that's Wally. We're going over fantasy football advice in relation to Davante Adams. And Wally, before we get into any of this, we recorded this video a week ago, but it was in relation to the Davante Adams potential landing spots. Now we know where he's at. Unfortunately, that middle part happened before we could post the first video, so a little bit of deja vu here.
Yeah, it's deja vu all over again. I'm excited to kind of go through the same kind of stuff with you again. First time for the listeners, so it's going to be a fun show.
Yeah, that was kind of a dress rehearsal, a spec show, if you will. And the first place I want to start off with is Davante's track record. I think anytime someone moves anywhere, there's a new factor, variable being thrown in. We just need to look in a vacuum. What are we dealing with right now? And for Davante's track record, this guy is still priority one for a lot of defensive coordinators. The specific spot he's being put in, which we'll go over in a little bit, he might not be anymore because Puka Nacua looks like a top 10 receiver in a lot of fronts. But just to kind of paint the picture on Davante Adams, it took him a while to take off. Didn't actually have a 1,000-yard receiving season until his fifth year. He was sharing touches with Jordy Nelson. Randall Cobb wasn't really Aaron Rodgers' favorite guy yet, but once he was, he definitely was for a while. Topped out around 1,500 yards, was the best receiver in the game for, I'm a firm believer, about 6 to 9 months. He was in between the DeAndre Hopkins.
First-time All-Pro.
Yeah, exactly. DeAndre Hopkins, and then there was like the Tyreek Hill, and somewhere in between there, Justin Jefferson was rising up, but he was getting the recognition, right? Volume has always been key. He's averaged 10 targets a game every game since 2018. So, we'll get to his age in a little bit, too. I know a lot of people are going to rip. He's on the wrong side of 30. That might be one of the reasons Goody didn't go after him for Green Bay, Brian Gutekunst. But like you just said, right? First team All-Pro at some point. This guy, I think if he is in the right situation, and he's in a much better one than he has been the last couple of years, I think he's still a top 10 wide receiver.
He's still a dude. There's a reason he was a first-team All-Pro 3 separate times in his career, and you still see it in there. I understand that last year you're talking about a guy that was in Vegas. You're talking about a guy that was in New York. In both places, miserable situations for him, and he was still a 1,000-yard receiver. He was still that guy anyways, and each year, effectively, since 2018, he has been a 1,000-yard receiver. He did miss that 1 year by 3 yards, but he missed 4 games as well in that. He's still a high-volume guy, a guy that is going to be viewed as a number one, not only by offenses, by defenses as well. Having Puka Nacua is going to really, I think, give opportunity to people that still have him in your kind of dynasty leagues out there. But he's a guy still. So I'm very excited to see what he can do with Matthew Stafford and playing with Puka Nacua on the other side of the field.
And we've seen other receivers that are around his age, maybe a little bit older, like a DeAndre Hopkins. Go back a couple more years. There's the Julio Jones. And in those scenarios, the drop-off is stark. It is quick. It is abrupt. And you really don't have time to batten down the hatches for it. It just kind of catches you off guard, and then it's week 12. Your trade deadline's pretty much come and gone, and you're just stuck with this guy. I want to treat each individual scenario as a unique one. It hasn't happened with Davante yet. He looked like he was firing on all cylinders, and even though Aaron Rodgers was forking him the ball over a decent amount the latter half of last year, 2025 Aaron Rodgers and that Jets offense, they weren't pretty. They were scoring less than 20 points per game, and that kind of segues into what I want to talk about with the ripple effect of Davante leaving the Jets. This was common knowledge a couple weeks ago. They let him go. He didn't have to abide by, and other teams didn't have to abide by, the free agency window. There was no tampering. He wasn't contractually obligated to wait for that. But what will the Jets look like without Davante? I think my big takeaway here for the last couple of years, or last couple of weeks, not years, excuse me, is that Garrett Wilson should take over some of that target share. There is still a ginormous question mark now that Aaron Rodgers is not going to be there anymore, and the Jets still have to figure out what they really have going on under center. But with Garrett Wilson, he's dealt with a lot of crap the first couple of years. He got Zach Wilson. He got Zach Wilson Part 2 when it was supposed to be Aaron Rodgers, who went out there with the American flag and had a few snaps and then was done. And then he got Aaron Rodgers, except Aaron Rodgers brought his buddy over and gave him the ball at a higher clip than Garrett Wilson. Despite that, similarly to how you brought up Davante Adams at 1,000-yard receiver seasons in not great scenarios, Garrett Wilson has had a pretty crappy draw the first 3 years, and he's still managed to be a 1,000-yard receiver. Now you clear out the competition, and I will call him competition specifically because of the world that those three were living in. It was Aaron Rodgers throwing to his buddy and getting as many of his other guys, Randall Cobb, Allen Lazard, coaching staff as well, in there as he possibly could. Maybe there was a world out there where Davante could have been the complementary piece, but that situation wasn't it. I think Garrett Wilson, if they get a halfway decent quarterback, whatever route they end up going, is going to be fine. He'll be a 1,000-yard receiver again. And as long as there's at least some decent complementary pieces around him, maybe they go out and get someone, draft someone, I think he could actually be in store or in for his best year yet. It's just a matter of who's going to be throwing him the ball.
I'm fired up for Garrett Wilson to be a number one wide receiver again this year. And we should start at least with the Jets because they are going to go back to that familiar place as bottom feeders. And I shouldn't even say go back because they were bottom feeders with the Ringling Brothers circus that was Aaron Rodgers coming to town last year. But what you brought up before is DeAndre Hopkins. The poor guy didn't have a guy throwing him the football in Houston, and look at the numbers he was producing. Garrett Wilson is that kind of wide receiver. He was able to shell out those big numbers in his first couple of years with Zach Wilson. Aaron Rodgers wasn't Aaron Rodgers last year. He doesn't hold on to the ball anymore. He doesn't look to throw the ball downfield. It's avoiding taking hits. So everything is in that 10 to 15 yards, short yardage kind of situation, and that's more equipped for Davante Adams' game. So Garrett Wilson, from a skill perspective to me at least, he is one of the best wide receivers in football, and I'm really excited eventually, maybe now, has the opportunity to showcase that as the Jets' true number one, whoever is going to be that quarterback in there, we'll see what that looks like. But he's going to be one of the few very bright spots on a team that is going to see turnover building throughout this entire organization over the next few years. It's just a matter of now, is it just Garrett Wilson from a fantasy perspective worth having on New York, or do you start looking at Breece Hall? Are you worried about his fall off? Is Braylon Allen's come up going to kind of scare you away from that? Is he somebody you might want to invest in deeper leagues? I think Garrett Wilson's for sure the Jet everybody's going to want to have on their team next year. But beyond that, it gets very fuzzy indeed.
Well, it's funny, right? I like that you brought up Breece Hall because there's a lot of these different situations now in 2025 where the running back room is a 2 or 3 platoon system. It's a running back by committee selection. And Breece Hall, even going into last year, seemed to be one of those exceptions. You could go Derrick Henry. You could go Jonathan Taylor when he's healthy. And then a lot of people were looking at Breece Hall, really good pass catcher. That 6 or 7 game period, whatever the hell it was, before he ended up getting hurt, was lightning in a bottle. Everyone was looking at that and going, oh, if we can just harness that for an entire season. And I think a lot of us were a little fooled and convinced, well, that's exactly what we're going to get. We're only going to get the best of Breece Hall because that's how football works. No, Braylon Allen ended up being really good. Breece Hall was really inefficient in some games. At some points when he was being eased back off that knee injury that ended the prior season, he was on Twitter complaining about his touches. So in terms of Breece Hall even being a Jet in the future, I'm not sure. Him being the main running back with the Jets, also not sure. And because, like you said, it's been the circus here, and Aaron Rodgers seemingly left this place worse than how he found it, I don't expect the Jets to be ahead in a whole lot of football games. In optimal scenarios where in the fourth quarter they're going, yeah, let's hand the ball off to Breece 3, 4, 5 times on this drive because we're trying to milk the clock. No, they're probably going to be in a lot of 27-10 football games with 5 minutes to go where the backups are starting to go on, and you really want to get, wide receivers 4, 5, and 6 and running backs 2, 3, and 4 experience. That's not good for Breece Hall. And I think in a little butterfly effect here, the fact that this team evidently got worse in the offseason, which some thought might not have been possible, doesn't help a running back who is relying on a game or relying on a play style that would really favor a team that's ahead. He wants the Jets to win 9, 10, 11 games so that he can get the ball in the second half. And then in terms of the dump-offs, Braylon Allen has that dimension too. Bit of a bigger guy, more of a I'm going to run you over type. But if you're efficient in this league, if you capitalize on your touches, you're going to get more of those. And we saw that with Braylon Allen. For Garrett Wilson, I'm not sure what the long-term future is here, but I think for dynasty owners, you can at least make the argument it cannot get worse. Like Zach Wilson 2 years in a row, and then Aaron Rodgers coming in looking kind of washed and bringing in another receiver to take away your targets. quite literally that was his job, is I'm just going to force feed it to him. I don't know if Garrett Wilson could have had it worse. So whether he's a Jet in the future, whether or not the quarterback situation gets better, or whether or not he goes somewhere else, I don't think it can get worse. I think we're statistically watching the basement right now for Garrett Wilson as long as he is as skilled as he seems to be. Now, moving along with Davante over to the Rams, that's the other end of this coin. How does this impact the Los Angeles Rams? Well, the main aspect to focus on here is that Puka Nacua is now competing with one of the best receivers of all time, and not someone who had one of the best seasons of all time. I should just say season of all time, in Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp had 1-2 really good years, and he hasn't been on the field a whole lot. And that's exactly what opened up the opportunity for a day 3 pick out of BYU to take over like Puka did. So, Wally, I just think it's kind of an interesting spot because while some may say, oh, Davante compliments him, Davante is a lot more likely to be out there for 14 to 17 games than Cooper Kupp was. And in turn, someone who's getting 10 targets a game might suck up some of those opportunities.
Well, yeah, and you brought up what opening up. Well, that's the kind of funny thing about this is Cooper Kupp was a guy that in his Triple Crown year was getting open with the best wide receivers in football. You can't say that anymore. He's a guy that last year he was bottom 20 in the league at being able to create space and be able to get open. Davante Adams is different than that. And you can't convince me that he's not going to go out there in LA and like Matthew Stafford did with Cooper Kupp the first time around when he got out there, he's going to make it a priority to get Davante Adams the ball. Sean McVay is going to make it a priority to get Davante Adams the ball. With Puka Nacua next to him, you saw what we can see with 2 true number 1 wide receivers in Minnesota. You have a better quarterback that's in LA. You're going to find 2 guys. I think you're going to have 2,000-yard receivers out there. All of a sudden, even beyond fantasy, you're going to see an offense that's prolific, very fun, and a team that could really surprise some people, win the NFC West. And who knows, maybe you're playing for a bye next year. And I think that all comes from Davante Adams and what he is going to be able to do to not only open up this offense himself, but the opportunities it will create for Puka Nacua, for Tyler Higbee, for other playmakers on this offense. The biggest question at all for the Rams is the offensive line going to be able to keep up? Is it going to be able to protect for Matthew Stafford? If it does, I think you can expect another monster year out of Davante. He's still in there, man. You're still seeing tail end of the prime. This isn't Julio Jones going off to Tennessee. This isn't DeAndre Hopkins going off to Tennessee or going off to Kansas City. This is Davante Adams going to play with a contender with one of the best young coaches we've ever seen. And I think that you can expect big things from him and from everybody around from a fantasy perspective on this offense.
Well, and that's a really good point. Peace and love to Gardner Minshew, Aiden O'Connell, Aaron Rodgers this past year. But Matthew Stafford, at least right now, the snapshot of what's going to be 2025, 2026 is in a lot better of a spot than those other guys, for lack of a better term. And, Puka might get his numbers shaved back a little bit, but it is going to be a complimentary piece. For Davante, I expect him to have a better season than he had last year. 1,000 yards and a little bit of change beyond that. Switch teams, had to learn a new playbook halfway through. Puka's on the other side. They're going to get these guys as far from each other as they possibly can. Davante's one of the best route runners in the entire league. At the age of 32, he still has some of the best hands in the entire league. And yes, the Rams do like to run the ball up the middle with Kyron Williams, especially when they're in those goal-to-go situations. I'd be curious if Sean McVay and that entire team philosophically changes a little bit, and all of a sudden you get Stafford thrown to the far pylon just trying to get one of the best receivers in the game the football, especially if that's more of a quick route combination, the offensive line doesn't look as good, and it doesn't make sense to run the ball up the gut all the time because while Kyron did have a lot of touchdowns, he wasn't the most efficient running back out there. I think it makes a lot more sense. On paper, it doesn't look like much, but the Rams scored 2 more points per game than the Jets last year. They were kind of in that middle tier throughout the entirety of the 2024-25 season, but you just hit the nail on the head, Wally. Davante's quarterback situation just got a hell of a lot better, and that makes a difference for someone regardless of what stage of their career they're in.
It absolutely does, and even at this stage that we're talking about, Stafford will be playing in his 37th year of life next year. He threw over 500 passes, so my only pushback would be, I know conventional wisdom says, wow, there's 2 number 1 wide receivers, therefore it's going to take away from Puka Nacua. all of a sudden you're converting on a couple of these 3rd and 7s because of Davante Adams or because Puka Nacua is getting open. You're going to have more opportunity on the field. If you're throwing the ball over 500 times, what my brain tells me is that that's probably 250 passes to Davante Adams and Puka Nacua.
Mm-hmm.
So you're still going to have the opportunity to have 80 plus catches. If you're a Puka Nacua fantasy owner, if you're a Davante Adams fantasy owner, there's more than enough of the pie to go around. In this offense, I truly think you could be looking at a year where Matthew Stafford kind of turned back the clock a little bit, and he does throw for 4,700 yards, and those two are going to be at the very front and center of that.
Yeah, especially with that 1-2 punch. I think a 4,700 yard season with a 17-game year, assuming everyone's healthy, is very, very realistic. And I think that's super important to focus on, too, that these two can complement each other. They can open up a lot of opportunities. If there's, I would say it's not a stretch at all to say that 50% of those passes from Matthew Stafford are either going to go to Davante Adams or Puka Nacua. They should open up a lot for each other. Last thing I want to touch on, at least for dynasty owners who are looking and are going, I don't care, man. That's a lot of targets that could go towards Davante. I'm worried. It's a 2-year deal. He is in his low 30s. The drop-off hasn't happened yet. It could happen at some point. There's an opt-out after a year, or he could retire. But at most, in the very, what we expect to be long career of Puka Nacua, you're going to lose 2 years to a complementary piece that's going to open up this offense. And at that point, you kind of have to be even more worried farther in the future because then, Stafford would hang it up at some point. I think this is just such a short-term problem for those who might be worried about the amount of targets that Davante is going to garner, because there's no promising he's going to be there for more than a year. Could retire, could be done. Stuff could happen. If they win it all, maybe they both hang it up. Maybe Stafford, there was buzzings about that in the offseason, and Davante ride off into the sunset together on the West Coast. And then it's still Puka's, he gets all the targets in the world from there. But, this is a short-term move. It's a team that did the same thing a couple of years ago. They swung for a lot of names, won the whole thing, and then not so much rebuilt, but had to retool as a 7-10 win team. And now they're back and contending again. But Davante is not going to be there forever. I don't think he's going to harm Puka by any means in terms of his fantasy football value. But I like the situation a lot, and that just elevated an offense probably into the top 10, top 8 echelon for sure. But that's the video for the most part. You've got how it's going to impact the Jets with Davante leaving. He didn't leave much behind. And how it's going to impact the Rams with how many different pieces they have fluttering around there. Make sure you leave a like. Make sure you subscribe. Tune into Armchair Fantasy Football for all of your fantasy needs leading up to the draft and out of free agency, trades, and everything in between. And we'll see you in the next video.